Hi guys, welcome to Simply Scuba. So regulators come in lots of different shapes, sizes and colors, but there is a major difference, and that is the performance in cold water. So of course some regulators are made to be specifically for travel because a lot of divers are traveling and regulators tend to be on the heavier side of your gear, so they make them a lot lighter, which is great for travel, but it does mean that you don't get as good of a cold water performance. So you do get some at the other end of the spectrum that are much heavier, but they're much better at cold water performance. So in this video, we're going to take a quick look at the different features and what makes a cold water regulator a cold water regulator and what makes a travel regulator a travel regulator. Okay, so first off is a little bit of physics, I'm afraid. So whenever anything goes from high pressure to low pressure, it means that it gets cold. So this is very similar to your aerosol can for your spray deodorant. If you spray it for a long time, it goes from high pressure to lower pressure and it gets cold. The exact same thing happens in your regulator. So if you're diving in cold water, you're going from high pressure inside your cylinder to the intermediate pressure of the second stage and then breathing it in. So you're reducing that pressure, so that means that your first stage, the metal bit that attaches to your cylinder, that tends to get very cold. And when you're mixing very cold with water, you tend to get ice. And when ice starts to form, especially on the inside of regulators, because equipment on the inside and parts need to move, if you get some solid ice buildup, it means that they can't move properly and you can tend to get a free flow. So with cold water regulators, you tend to get a really big chunk of metal, and that acts as a big heat sink. It actually absorbs heat from the surrounding water and prevents the metal from getting quite so cold. So on cold water regulators, you tend to find these kind of heat sink fins. So these just improve the surface area to volume ratio, and these just mean that it's going to absorb more heat from the water and dissipate the amount of coals that's building up, and that means that it's going to reduce the probability that any ice is going to form. So very, very important. But what that does mean is that you tend to get more weight. So a big heavy first stage is what you really want for cold water regulators, and big sort of heat fins. Again, they're making them heavier, but they're improving that cold water performance. Another feature that you can tend to see on most cold water regulators is some kind of environmental sealing. So the external water pressure really does need to get to the internal sort of working parts of your first stage to allow them to balance. Otherwise it gets harder to breathe the deeper down you go. But you don't want any sort of cold water, salt water or any ice kind of getting onto the inside and preventing those parts from moving. So the regulator manufacturers have come up with environmental sealing, which is just typically an end cap or some kind of seal that is it's not semi-permeable, but it allows it to move. So the external force of the water pressure can push on it. It can affect the internal sort of workings, but water can't physically get inside. So cold water regulators, you'll tend to have some kind of environmental sealing, and that means that sort of ice crystals can't form on the inside of the first stage. So then when we move over to travel regulators, because typically you're not diving, manufacturers tend to have a baseline of 10 degrees Celsius water temperature. That's what's defined as cold water. So that's pretty cold. So most people, especially traveling divers, when they're going to the Red Sea or the Maldives or somewhere nice to dive, you typically don't get water temperatures anywhere near that. So they decided, instead of making heavier regulators, why not make a lightweight regulator? Okay, it can't work in cold temperatures, but it's much, much lighter, which makes it much easier to travel. So in which case you get something like this. So this is the Aqualung Micron. So as you can see, the first stage is much, much smaller, which is great for travel. There's still a decent amount of metal to withhold all the pressure and everything that you need, but because it isn't such a big chunk of metal, it doesn't act as such a great heat sink, so when it gets down to really cold temperatures, it can't quite cope and ice can form, but it's not what it's made for. This is made for traveling divers in the 20+ degrees Celsius waters. So this one, as you can see, it doesn't have an environmental seal. So on the inside of there, it can still get to the internal mechanism. So it still means that it's balanced, it adjusts as you go down, so you get a nice smooth breathe at any depth. But it does mean that water can get on the inside. A little harder to clean out. You want to make sure you get all of the salt and any verdigris sort of out from the inside. So flush it out really well after every dive, but it does mean it's a lot lighter. On the second stage as well, the second stage works in much the same way, except it's just scaled down. It's much smaller. It doesn't need to have the same sort of surface area and all that sort of internal volume. It can afford to be much smaller and more compact, which means that it can reduce the jaw fatigue as well, because you don't have a big heavy second stage in your mouth. It's much lighter, you don't have to bite down quite as much, you don't get that jaw ache. You still get similar features like adjustable breathing, and on some others you get that adjustable venturi, but it's much smaller, much easier to pack down, and of course much lighter. So if you're on a real budget for your baggage allowance, it can be a fantastic alternative to buying your own regulators. Okay, so that was a quick look at the difference between a cold water regulator and a lightweight travel regulator. But what regulator do you use and why? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching and safe diving. We are an online dive store serving the UK and the world for all your diving equipment needs. So why not visit us at simplyscuba.com or click the box on your screen.